Let me welcome you all. This is a session on rethinking global climate ambitions in the face of Arctic emissions, translated Permafrost, the Arctic in You. And today we have three terrific speakers. Their full bios are in the conference app, so I won't go into great detail, but I'll introduce each of them briefly. We have John Holdren, who is the research professor at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and co-director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the school's Belfer Center. He was President Obama's science advisor and director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy through both of President Obama's terms. And he is now the Teresa and John Heinz Research Professor of Environmental Policy at Harvard. Sue Natale is the senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center and the lead of their Permafrost Pathways project. She is an Arctic ecologist who focuses on permafrost thaw, motivated by an acute awareness of the risks that it poses. Steve Hamburg is the chief scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund. He oversees EDF's scientific efforts, including work on quantifying methane emissions from the natural gas supply chain and the use of remote sensing to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to start with a few general questions, and then with about 20 minutes to go, I'm going to open it up to your questions. So let me start with a fairly broad question. Why should anyone living in the temperate areas in our planet worry about permafrost thaw in the Arctic?
Well, I'm happy to start on that one. There are a couple of reasons. One reason is that it's the emissions from society's activities in the temperate regions, above all, that are driving global climate change. And global climate change is happening 3 to 4 times faster in the Arctic than in the world on average. And if the world doesn't slow down its emissions at a greater rate than is happening today, all that is going to get worse. It's going to get worse the fastest in the Arctic. And there are feedbacks from it getting worse faster in the Arctic, which in turn will accelerate climate change worldwide if we're right in current estimates of how much carbon dioxide and methane will ultimately come out of the thawing permafrost. So those are two reasons that people in the temperate zone should be concerned about it.
You want to add?
Well, I think you did a great job.
Okay.
I guess I would say, I would suggest not to just worry about it, but potentially think about doing something about it, because as John said, the causes of permafrost thaw are from global emissions. And so regardless of where you are, you have the power to work with your decision makers to try to do something to stop permafrost thaw. And so it's not something that's just happening far away that you have no control over, because greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, are globally mixed. And so we're even though it may seem like far away, it actually is not that far away. It's very much a part of your life wherever you are.
So let me drill down a little bit. And
You didn't let Steve have a shot at it.
I'm going to get to Steve in a second. I want to follow up on this. And can you say a few words about what you're doing in the Arctic right now on this permafrost, the actual study effort that you have underway?
Sure. So I'm leader of Permafrost Pathways, of which John and his team are partners on. And the goal is to think about how do we address the impacts of permafrost thaw, and thinking about what are the problems. Well, one main problem is that we don't even really have a good sense of greenhouse gas emissions from the permafrost region, so from the tundra and boreal region right now. We don't really have a very good sense of what they will be in the future. We know that we're not accounting for these potential emissions in our policy, both in our terms of our mitigation policy, as well as in our policies to adapt to climate change. And so what we're doing in the project is to greatly ramp up our monitoring on the ground, so setting up instrumentation across the Arctic to measure CO2 and methane, to get information about permafrost thaw into pan-Arctic and global models so that we can have a better understanding of how these processes will impact future climate. Make sure that information is known to decision makers and hopefully they can act on it. So when we think about staying below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, we have a better understanding of the budget. And then also working with people on the ground. So we have 10 partners in Alaska, as well as working with other Indigenous Alaska Native communities on how do we, what are the impacts that people are seeing now, and how are people responding to it? What information do they need to respond to it? And how do we use this lessons learned from working with folks who are having to relocate or having to move homes? And what are lessons learned that we can then scale up more broadly at the federal level or internationally?
Thank you. Steve, your organization has invested heavily in something called methane sat.
Yep.
I presume SAT stands for satellite.
It does.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, before I even talk about it, let me just pick up on what Sue said to add to what John had said prior. So one of the things that Sue said that's really important is the feedbacks. And we have to recognize these positive feedbacks that are occurring. And we've, as a society, have spent too much time focused on tipping points, which is important, but there's a lot of feedbacks that aren't tipping points and they accumulate. And it's not just in the Arctic, it's across many biomes. So we have to think about the problem. It's not just doing something, the hill's getting steeper over time. And so one of the things that we have to do is look at the places where we potentially can do something and think about this steeper hill that we have to climb because of the feedbacks we're happening in natural systems. So we need the data that Sue talked about. We need to recognize these systems and not think of them as static. They're very dynamic and they are responding. So one of the things that we're doing at Environmental Defense Fund, and Steve Wolfstein's in the audience here, so he and I conceived of this idea that we really needed better data. Because as Sue said, we don't know a lot. People assume we know a lot more about greenhouse gas emissions than we actually do. And we need high quality data. We need empirical data. Almost all the data that we currently have from human directly produced greenhouse gases is calculated, not measured. So almost none of the CO2 is measured directly. And up until fairly recently, we weren't measuring methane except in rare cases, which means that we don't have the level of understanding of those emissions to take the actions that are most effective. We're always dealing with generalities, not specifics. And there's a wide range of difference in how much is emitted by different folks doing different activities. So what we did with methane sat is working together with Steve, a lot of the work happening in this building was really to figure out what kind of data do we need to change that narrative. Then could we build a satellite that could produce that data? And then of course, could we raise the funding, philanthropic funding to do that and make these data totally available to the globe so we can get radical transparency. And we now have methane sat flying. It's doing well. It launched at the beginning of March. And we will start putting out data that will start to provide an empirical basis of comparing emissions around the world. It'll be primarily focused on oil and gas emissions, but also on agriculture. And we will do natural systems to the degree we can, but it will not be, we do not have enough downlink capacity. So we won't have regular monitoring of the Arctic as much as I'd love to say we won't have that. But the key here is we really need high quality data so we can act and differentiate between the things that have the most potential today and those things we got to get to, but we can put off to later.
I want to elaborate on two things because there are two gaps in what we've said so far that worry me a little bit. And one of them is there have been direct measurements for decades of how much carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere.
Absolutely.
And how much methane is building up in the atmosphere. And by analyses of the isotopic composition of the methane and the carbon dioxide that's been added, we have a pretty good idea how much came from direct human activities, how much came from ecosystems, either influenced by climate change or influenced by human interventions. But Steve is absolutely right. What we don't have real data on, to any very great extent, is the identification of exactly where those emissions are coming from. And that's very important from the standpoint of crafting mitigation measures. In terms of crafting adaptation measures, knowing what's happening in terms of the buildup in the atmosphere and translating that into local impacts is what's really important, because all adaptation is local. The greenhouse problem as a whole is global. The second thing I wanted to add, we got into the permafrost thing without talking about the specific forms of damage that it's doing to the communities and the people and the ecosystems in the region. And just to be sure everybody understands, permafrost thaw is causing buildings to crack and collapse. It's causing pipes to crack and collapse, including sewage pipes in villages around the Arctic. It's causing the village walkways between buildings in villages across the Arctic to collapse. It's causing the refrigeration systems historically used in many of these villages, which are basically little caverns cut out of the permafrost that keep food cold all year round, and they're failing because the permafrost is thawing. Roads, runways. It is a big deal for the people who live in the Arctic, and it's also contributing to changes in Arctic ecosystems, which are affecting what people can catch in the rivers, what they can hunt on the land. This is a big deal for the people who live there, and I see a member of our International Advisory Board in the Arctic Initiative here at Harvard sitting in the second row, Yvonne Peter, who is a leader in his village on the Yukon and also a leader in the U.S. academic community at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, who knows a lot about this, who knows a lot about the impacts on the ground. And I hope he'll have a chance to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I will use that as a segue onto that topic. You have a lot of villages in Alaska. You have a lot of villages in Russia. You have villages in Canada. The cost of moving a village a couple of miles is very high. I've seen things between $250 to $400 million. What happens
to move one village?
One village.
Right.
What's going to happen to these villages?
I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm not an expert. This is not my expertise. The cost of doing nothing is more expensive than the cost of doing something. And the longer we wait and continue to talk about that we shouldn't do anything because it's expensive, it's going to get more and more expensive. These I can talk about in the U.S. There's a lot of small villages across Alaska, not connected to the road system. They're all federally recognized tribes, so there is a federal trust responsibility from the U.S. government who force many of these communities to be in the place where they are. So now they've put them at risk to deal with this. So it's beyond my expertise to say where the money's going to come from, but I will say the money has to come from somewhere. What's happening, like visually what happens, I mean, John talked about some of this, but like when I could just talk to permafrost thaw, you get ground sinking, and just think about like the vegetation here. A wetland is a little bit lower and wetter, very different vegetation than a forest. So you have land shifting from one type of vegetation that it provides very important food resources for humans, for wildlife, to a very different system. You have lakes that can drain, like literally, like overnight. You have land that's just gone. So when we think of loss and damage on the international level about climate change, literally loss, like land that can then be lost to the ocean or to river. So there's a lot that's going on, and it really needs led by the communities impacted with a coordinated federal, state, government support of this. But it is a big issue, and it is very, it's not going to get cheaper.
Are you seeing the same thing in Russia and in Canada?
There are communities also impacted in Canada. I don't know the political system, but yes, communities are impacted by permafrost thaw everywhere. We're seeing, and in businesses are impacted, gas and oil industry. It is an issue. You think, permafrost, it's two important things. It's ice and carbon, and that carbon's in the form of organic matter, which then can be released as greenhouse gases. But ice is infrastructure. Right? You don't have to know a lot. You don't have to be a permafrost expert to know. You go from ice to water, you're losing stable ground. So think of all this stuff that's like lots of Russia railroads and infrastructure and gas and oil built on top of this of ice frozen ground, right? So just use your imagination, and you can imagine where.
In Russia, it's a really big deal. In the oil and gas producing regions in Siberia in Russia, huge problems with permafrost thaw affecting infrastructure, pipelines, drilling rigs. Even Putin knows it's a problem in Russia, which of course is a high bar.
But when we think about the cost, like there's a cost. Like there's always a cost. There's a cost. We're spending the money right now, right? Continuously fixing roads, continuously, making sure, like, dealing with all of this. So it's not that we're going from free right now if we do nothing, and then this big cost if we do something. It's a continual cost.
Let me ask one more follow-up on this. Is the people who are being impacted in these villages, historically, the U.S. government figures out what the best answer for them is and then does it. But what we're finding now is the importance of reaching out to the villages and the people who live it, the people who are affected. Your project has an element in it of bringing these villages and talking to people directly. What have you learned from those conversations?
Pretty much everything. Like when I work with the community, it's often the conversations about, like, what's happening here. So everything I know about that place, it starts from what the community is telling me. If I've never been to a place, I do have satellite image. I can look. I mean, in the north, it's very, very, very difficult to get satellite image, especially where I work and the southwest Alaska, just because it's cloudy all the time. But you have some satellite image, so you can have a sense of what's going on, but you really don't know until you've been in a place. And local knowledge, and particularly Indigenous knowledge, which is information that goes back generations, is much. I have academic knowledge, which is quite different and quite, like, I can get very specialized in a specific area, but to really understand a land and to understand how a system works and where a system's going and think about that holistically, that's needs to come from the partners and the tribes and Indigenous knowledge holders. It's actually not something I've ever been trained or grown up or part of my way of thinking. I mean, I can try to learn as much as I can, but it's really important, yes, because communities impacted by climate change should be the one leading it, and they are federally recognized tribes. But because climate change is so complex, it is not it's not just one item we can focus on, even in the context of permafrost. And so in order to understand that complexity, that's what I rely on my Indigenous partners, Indigenous knowledge.
And just to stress one point about that, Sue mentioned that the knowledge goes back for generations. We absolutely rely on our contacts across these Indigenous peoples to understand how it was, not just how it is today. And how it was versus how it is today is an important part of our understanding of where it's going.
Steve, do you want to add to this?
Well, I don't work a lot, but I did spend some time 20 years ago at the edge of the permafrost zone in Mongolia. And even 20 years ago, you're seeing dramatic impacts. And that relates to the shifts politically, because, of course, the Russians, the Soviets, had a lot of influence in this region. Then they left. And you see the infrastructure issues because you're right on the edge. So the permafrost, that's right at the edge of the permafrost moving north. And the impacts were very visible and very well understood by the local communities. And they were abandoning large quantities. And those communities, a lot of them are nomadic. So it's not just the physical built structures and villages. It was also the nomadic people's traditional routes of migration were changing. Because the forest structure, the land structures, there was massive changes. And that was 20 years ago. I have not been back since. I spent a couple summers working with Mongolian scientists and looking at these issues. But it was quite impressive in terms of the level of change, and quite unclear how the cultural context, because of these major political shifts. And there was a lot of suppression of local knowledge. And so I think we have to think about it in those multiple layers across these different geographies. And that in a way is a great test bed because it is literally on the edge of the permafrost zone. So they're going to see it even faster and more deeply than you will to the north.
So we're very concerned about the emissions of methane and carbon dioxide from permafrost thaw, but simultaneously, there's another problem going on, which is last year we had approximately 150 wildfires up in Canada. You have had multiple wildfires in Siberian Arctic, a lot of it lightning caused, and we've had a number of them in Alaska. How do these wildfires contribute to the emission problem, and are these likely to get worse, and how serious should we take these?
First, they're likely to get a lot worse. The average area burned in Alaska over the last 30 or 40 years has multiplied by somewhere between 3- and 4-fold, and it's expected to go up at least another 2-fold by 2050, almost no matter what we do. Second point, one of the emissions that matters a lot from wildfires is fine smoke, which propagates over hundreds and even thousands of miles and is a health problem in Philadelphia and New York and Chicago, even if the wildfires are far to the north. We've had Canadian wildfires that made air quality in Philadelphia and New York worse than the air quality in Delhi, which is otherwise generally known as the worst air quality in the world. But in addition, there's a big feedback between permafrost thaw and wildfires. Permafrost thaw, in a variety of ways, makes wildfires more likely. Wildfires make permafrost thaw go faster. And so you have yet another one of these really nasty feedbacks where each cycle accelerates the whole process. Wildfires and permafrost, big deal.
But again, sorry,
I was just going to add something about wildfire.
please. I was too, but go ahead.
Okay. So in the north, we think about wildfire, we think about a tree burning, right? But in the north, most of the combustion is coming from carbon that's below ground. And so when you have the greenhouse gases that come out, you have this combustion above ground and below ground. And I'll come back to that combustion that's coming out below ground. But when you burn off this organic layer, this top material, it's a very good insulator. And it does get warm in the north in the summertime. And so in this acts as a very good insulator to keep the permafrost cool. So when you remove that, you then make that permafrost vulnerable for years and for decades. So now you have this frozen material that is now thawed, that can be broken down and releasing greenhouse gases, leading to more thaw, as John mentioned. And in cases, it can cause drainage. I mean, sometimes you get permafrost thaw, it gets wetter. Sometimes it does get drier. There's cases where it gets drier. There could be more combustion. And just one more thing, and then I'll pass on. A big issue here is that the Pan-Arctic models, the global models, first, many of them don't have permafrost thaw in them. None of them have this below ground combustion, and none of them have this interaction between permafrost thaw and wildfire. So what that means is when we're thinking about, what will this world look like in the future and how much emissions will come from the north, we're missing a huge part of that because we don't have these processes that we know happen accounted for in these models. And so it's not just that, like, this is happening, but this is happening and we're not dealing with it. And to me, those are some of the biggest issues here, what's happening in the north with permafrost and wildfire.
Yeah, so I just want to build on what was said. And again, there's a bit of a theme here, is we know relatively little about the change in greenhouse gas emissions from these wildfires. We do not have good high quality data. So we recently actually sponsored a National Academy's workshop on this issue, because we are limited. We do not have an ability, and these things take many different forms, and Sue talking about how deep they go in the soil. And the challenge we have is we don't know this feedback and how large it is, and we aren't tracking it to really understand. And we also have to start thinking about, because these systems largely are unmanaged systems. So we don't have roads in them, we haven't. It's not like forest management in the lower 48 in a lot of places where fire changes because of forest management. We're talking about the environment forcing changes, the climate changing, which in turn is leading to these lightning strikes becoming large. And it really drove it home, and I always forget which year it is. I think it was 2005, which was the biggest wildfire in Alaska history. And I happened to be up in the Arctic and going along the Haul Road and crossed right through that area that burned at that time. And the level of scale and the amount of, it was just beyond I'd never experienced anything on that scale before. And the fire was still going. It had passed enough that it was safe on the road, but there were still things burning. And that's the whole point. It was still burning because of these materials. So we've been thinking a lot, and Peter Frumhoff's here in the audience, he's been thinking a lot about it, is how do we actually think about interventions? We have to start thinking about these systems very differently. We have to realize, what can we do? Because if we just allow these feedbacks to keep going, which is maybe in some cases all we can do, we do have to think about, are there interventions? And we've never historically intervened. Certainly Alaska's never done it. Russia's never done it. We've never intervened in these fires, right? Except if it right around a village or something, we go after it. We have to think about if that's an appropriate paradigm going forward. And I don't think we've thought it through very well. And there is a group of people now trying to approach this and figure out what we can do. And I think we have to think about this whole issue about, where do we need to intervene, even as much as we'd instinctively not want to intervene, because in fact these feedbacks are going to be really devastating.
This was going to be my next question, is how do you intervene? Because, when we had the fires last year in Canada, we sent endless number of crews up to Canada, and it was just like putting trying to hold up a dam with a finger. I mean, so what they said, winter will intervene. We'll have winter, it will snow, and the fires will go away. Well, actually, some of them didn't go away because they were underground. So when you talk about intervention, what are some of the interventions that might be possible?
Well, I think it's still to be determined, but one of the things we really need to think about is, by the time we usually see these fires and understand them, they're already very large, and the resources it takes to do anything of size is either beyond the scope, and certainly if we do it, and we see it in the US, even in the lower 48s, the sheer quantity of money to intervene in so many systems is really, it's the biggest single item in the Forest Service's budget, is fighting forest fires. So what we have to think about is, can we understand, and we've been working on a project for the last couple of years, can we understand better through remote sensing when they start, and model them better so that we know which ones are likely to blow up in a way that is not acceptable and which ones aren't, and then have targeted interventions to try and deal with it. And there's an experiment, actually, Peter's been involved with getting going, to actually try some of these ideas out in Yukon Flats. Hopefully I'm not spilling the beans on something I'm not supposed to. And I think it's this kind of thinking we have to think about. And as much of it's, certainly when I worked in uncut wilderness in Alaska, and I spent some time there working, would have never thought, would never approach that we just need to keep our hands off. I think those days are past. We have to start thinking, again, we don't know if we can do it, but we have to think proactively. What can we do to start to change and bend the emissions curves? Because we can't wait to do it just, which we also have to do in reducing greenhouse gas emissions directly, because these feedbacks are so strong already.
Yes, can I just add one?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, one thing. I'm not a fire management expert by any means, but we call these unmanaged lands, but they have been managed and lived on for a very, very, very long time, and there are traditional indigenous burn practices that. Right now, we have I guess federal government has hands-off policy, but I do think this is something that if we want to really think about, land and practices that are like respectful of the land, and that, the fire regimes are getting out of control, and it's partly because of climate, but I do think that we may want to rethink about our approach, and this may be one way of doing that.
Let me segue into a sort of slightly different question. So your organization has invested heavily in setting up, I think it's over 40 monitoring or research stations, and you have, I think, 5 towers scattered around the Arctic, but about half the Arctic is in Russia. So if we're going to understand what's happening, don't we have to understand what's going on in Russia? And how do you do this in light of the war in Ukraine and the difficulty in interacting with Russian scientists and total inability to interact with the Russian government?
So our goal is to send up 10 of these carbon dioxide, methane kind of landscape level. It's called eddy covariance towers. 10 may not sound like a huge number, but there's not that many that run year round or rules to run them year round. The plan was before the war to get about 5 of them out in Russia because that is where the biggest gap is in terms of on the ground measurements. And so Russia is a challenge. We can't do that. Some people may think that you can do more work, say, in Canada, and we are doing more work in Canada, but the ecosystems in Russia are quite different. I mean, just think about the forests on permafrost. They're deciduous needle leaf forests. In North America, we have very, very different trees. They have different burn trajectories. They have very different climates. And so you don't have a proxy, really, for Russia. Like, we do have these huge gaps. There is satellite data, but satellite data right now is not getting us emissions, fluxes. And so we are still working and collaborating with Russian scientists as much as we can. There are people I've worked with for decades now. That's not, it challenges, they can't share data out. We can't get equipment in, but we can exchange knowledge. And so if we say use satellite data to come up with some map of here's emissions or fire, whatever it is, at least having someone on the ground to say, is this realistic? Is this what you've been seeing? Does this year, was it a weird year 2 years ago where we can expect to see this? It's right now the best we can do. I would love for there to be more because most of the permafrost region is in Russia and most of the carbon emissions, or the carbon that is stored in the permafrost is in Russia. So that's, yeah, I mean, it's just all I can do is, I guess, science diplomacy one-on-one with the Russian scientists that I know, and to try to keep that relationship
And there
going.
are some interactions between Russian and U.S. scientists taking place at small meetings organized on neutral ground, not in Russia and not in the United States. There have been a number of these that I know about. I'm sure there are more that I don't know about. So the interactions are not zero, although it is a great handicap to move forward in the way we had planned without the ability to get equipment there, without the ability to get data out in a large scale and organized way.
And if I can just jump in a second, I think one of the things, and I'll make a plug for MethaneSat, we will be collecting methane and CO2 because we also can do CO2. So we will be getting flux data from northern Russia. We'll see how good it is, but we're going to do it because we have to do oil and gas, so that's a key area, and we will have to do it. So I can't promise, but we will be getting data, and satellites make it possible because a lot of parts of the world, and it's not unique in this particular, it's obviously acute because of the Ukraine war, there are a lot of places you can't get planes or you can't get on the ground to make measurements because we've been working with the UN extensively to get scientists, not US scientists, just any scientists from all over the world, and we can't get permission to go to lots of places. And the idea that we can start using remote sensing to start to build stronger data, I think, is a powerful tool. It's not going to do it all, but I think it can really help us.
But I think the challenges are, as far as I know, MethaneSat needs light. Correct. So we're missing the entire winter season. It's quite cloudy. I don't know if clouds are a problem, but also the levels, even though we talk about, greenhouse gases from the Arctic, the levels are very, very low. Most of the cases for methane, it's uptake. Even when we're seeing sources, the issue is just a humongous area. So a satellite that's tuned, I don't know if that's proper language, for seeing a point source is a different
We're seeing area sources.
Beast than these very, very low levels of the Arctic. And it's huge, so you have to be collecting, and offloading data. So it's definitely, it's a huge advance, but we also then need to be thinking about more, how do we do this specifically targeted for some of these unique environments?
Yeah, I think we'll be able to do more than you think, but again, we have to figure this out. We're not just looking at the whole idea of MethaneSat. It's actually to look at area sources with a very, very high precision, higher than any other satellite.
Probably more than we think, but less than we need.
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that, John.
So you're doing the satellite work and you're doing on the ground. How do you guys interchange all or exchange information that you get? Because you're getting different information, but both can help each other.
Yeah, and I'll give an example of how we use it. So, when we collect information on the ground, it gets shared out. So we would take this information, maybe we'll model it for the Pan-Arctic, and that's a gridded data set that then can be shared. For maybe ground truthing for saying, is the satellite, what the satellite is showing me, does this make sense? So one is shared out, and then we haven't had this information from satellites, but we will use, say, information from a top-down model. So you're collecting information from tall towers or from airborne towers, and then people kind of model downward. And so we'll compare what we're doing on the ground with what's coming up on the top. Sometimes it matches, sometimes it doesn't. So when it doesn't, you're like, okay, what's going on? Is this information wrong? So you're kind of figuring out where do these two pieces of information converge, and how can we, it's really useful in science to have two different ways of getting information and bringing them together. And so they're not biasing each other, right? So one isn't derived from the other one. So when they are supporting each other, that's really helpful. And when they're not, that's also really helpful. So
I would add to that we go to each other's meetings. I've seen Stephen Hamburg at a number of meetings we've organized here. And Steve Wolfsey, of course, is just across the campus from me. I talk to those folks. And I would note that there are at least 2 scientific papers that I know of that are in process that have Steve Hamburg and Sue Natali, and Steve Wolfsey's on at least one of them, maybe on both of them. I'm on them. We're doing papers together. I mean, there is a lot of communication between these groups. Again, probably less than you think, more than you think, but less than we need. We could talk even more and should.
Right. And so what we've done is we have 2 teams. So the team that Steve leads here at Harvard, which is doing the data directly off the satellite. And then we have a team in EDF that is independent scientists who do work on remote sensing. And we actually look at the validation explicitly. The teams do it independently for exactly that reason. So we can say, yeah, we think this is working, and we have a whole team to absolutely do what Sue said. So I'll just really endorse that. But the key here is that we are bringing new technology, and we're bringing new capacity, and I really do think we're seeing a data revolution emerging. Is it enough, to John's point? Of course not. But we are going to take a massive step forward. I'm really confident of that. And in so doing, we will start to get greater clarity. We're putting on better glasses. Are they going to be everything we want? No, but I really do think we're at an inflection point, and that inflection point will make a big difference.
I endorse that completely.
Okay, let me ask my final question, and I'm going to open it up to the audience. So in your annual report, you suggested that carbon emissions from permafrost thaw will reduce global carbon budgets to remain below 2 degrees C by about 20%. So you get this data, and it comes in both from the satellite and from the monitoring stations. And you find that there is a significantly greater amount of carbon dioxide emissions and a significantly greater amount of methane emissions. And you get on the plane and you go down to Washington to tell the government your good news. Who do you go to, and what's the likely reaction in Washington? Are they going to suddenly change their carbon plans given this information?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to punt it to John, but let me just say,
I knew she was going to do that.
First of all, that's why it's good to be on a panel with you. I'm so happy that someone's reading the annual report. That is from a paper that is in review right now, which is where we did model, used a Earth system model of intermediate complexity but permafrost thaw, below ground combustion, and this combination of permafrost thaw and wildfire, and said, what does this mean for a 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius carbon budget? So I talk to whoever I can. I do think, I have to say, I was at this conference that the Arctic Initiative held, and I was on a panel with someone from the State Department, and I was so pleased because he was saying my lines. Like he was talking about these numbers and carbon emissions from permafrost thaw, and I thought, okay, well, people are getting it. Are they changing actions? I don't know, but we do need to make sure that this information is out there. But now I'm going to punt it to John to say, what do we do? How do we get people to respond?
Well, first of all, we have already been talking to the climate change envoys on both the U.S. and the Chinese side. I have talked to Zhanhua about this, who recently stepped down as the climate envoy of China. I haven't talked to the new one yet. I just missed him. I was in Beijing for a week last week and talking with a lot of their climate change influencers about this and about other issues in climate change, and their climate change envoy was in the United States at the time, so I didn't get to see him, but I will get to see him. We also talk about this at COP meetings, and where we get to the climate policy influencers around the whole world. And in my judgment, they're starting to listen. They're paying attention. That doesn't mean that they're ready to jump yet. In fact, we already know enough about other impacts of climate change all over the world to persuade people, one would think, to take more drastic action than they're taking now. And one of the mysteries that some of us are also looking at is what's missing? Why are policymakers not yet willing to do nearly as much as the things we do know justifies? Because as Steve Hamburg emphasizes, there's a lot we don't know, but we know enough to justify a much greater effort at addressing these problems than is now being exerted. And we're trying to add to this the problems that permafrost thaw may impose on this question of how much reduction of society's global emissions do you need in order to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees C. But I have to be a little bit pessimistic, even while I remain optimistic enough to keep talking to these folks, a little pessimistic that what we already know hasn't been enough, and that's a mystery. And with how do we make the addition of this additional clarity sufficiently powerful to cause a big change? My guess is it may not, and it might be a drastic increase in heat-related illness all around the world that does it. It might be an increase in torrential downpours and flooding that finally tips it. We talk about the relationship, if any, between biogeophysical tipping points and political tipping points. Can you imagine any tipping point in impacts of climate change on people and ecosystems that would cause a real political tipping point? And it's hard to visualize what it might take.
And let me just jump in to say, because I have been pushing that we need better data, but I'm even more optimistic than John. And I'll use the example of methane, which I work on, and I've worked on for a decade plus. So when I started working extensively on it, and we did at EDF, and when we started thinking about a methane sat, you go to the COP, and methane was buried in the conversation. We now have more than 150 countries who publicly acknowledge it. You can talk to the climate envoys in any country, and methane is on their agenda. They get it. We could say, okay, is there enough action? But the point is that we moved so quickly, relatively speaking, to recognizing there were some other levers that we can pull that really make a difference. And I'll never forget in Glasgow when the global methane pledge was rolled out, someone came up to me and said, wow, methane came out of nowhere. And obviously there were a lot of people working hard to get that to happen. But the point is it got momentum and it got moving. And sometimes it's hard when you're in that phase where you aren't seeing it come up above the water line. But we are seeing those kinds of changes, and having had conversations in almost every one of the major capitals about this before it came above the water line. It is a different world now, and people are leaning in. We're getting a lot of responsiveness. We had, at the last COP, we had over 50 national oil companies say they would make dramatic reductions. These are groups that don't traditionally get out ahead to say we are going to reduce our methane emissions and we're going to be held accountable. And that's one of the things we're doing with methane sat is we're going to hold them accountable. So I think there is things happening, and I think we just have to keep talking and pushing till we break out and people start to recognize it, and then action will happen.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes, in the back. We're going to have a microphone because this is being recorded.
To the question about why isn't more being done, I think one of the serious answers has been raised yesterday and today. There are forces who are trying to keep knowledge from being well spread because they have a vested interest in keeping people ignorant and keeping things from happening. That's my comment on the one side. My question about the satellite data is, when will the data start to be made public? Through what media? And are you finite or resolute enough to be able to pick out specific sources, say some fracker in the Permian Basin or some refinery in Louisiana?
Sure. So the I won't comment on your comment. I'll leave that to be what it is. So the data will start getting rolled out over the next 6 months. We will be fully operational, meaning the full data processing at the beginning of next calendar year. The data will be posted. We have a portal. It will all be available on Google Earth Engine. Any non-commercial use, you can download the data at no cost. Commercial uses require a commercial license, but anybody in academia qualifies as non-commercial, in the media and et cetera, civil society. And we will be able to see some large point sources, but we're really designed to look at the total picture. There are additional satellites. One satellite's never going to be enough, right? So there's an ecosystem of satellites. There's another one going to be launched in the next, the beginning of July. Carbon Mapper, that's designed to look at individual points. The key we have to recognize is not just in the Arctic are these diffuse emissions matter. Smaller emissions dominate for methane for sure. So it's not about, we need to find those big emissions and address them, but they're not the majority of the problem by a lot. Even in the oil and gas industry, certainly in agriculture, certainly in natural systems. So we will be providing the first comprehensive high precision data on these area sources. The data will be made public as quickly as we can. We will have a relatively low latency, and I'm not going to, with a couple of particular people in this room, I'm not going to say what we're going to get when, because they are under pressure to help produce those data, but we will. And the key that we've said to everybody on the team, from the people who literally built the instrument, and a lot of incredibly talented scientists and engineers, is the only measure of success of this mission is do emissions go down. And that's how we're measuring ourselves. Everybody is measuring themselves against that metric. So we have a data to action pipeline. We have advocacy folks. We have the science team here at Harvard. We have everybody's organized, recognizing they are a piece of the pipeline. Producing good data is not sufficient. It's got to get all the way to the action side.
Yes, please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Pashka Griffiths. I'm at the Ed School here. You just said all the way, it needs to get all the way to the action side. And I was thinking about your data, and when you mentioned where is it, and I thought of ArcGIS, probably aware of the
Esri, yeah.
Esri, the geospatial information systems. And I also work in innovation education, and I was curious if any innovators, be it through business, nonprofit, or academic, are actively seeking your information and interested in collaborating. I was just so curious if you get wind of that at all in your work.
So absolutely, this is a collaborative, this is a team sport, this is a collaborative effort. We can't do it by ourselves. I don't care how many people we have and how good the team is. And I think that we have a great team at many institutions, including this one. So we are actively talking to many people. We've done a very large set of conversations across over the last 2 months with lots of different users looking at it. I will be in New York talking to the financial community in 2 days, meeting with them. We're meeting with potential users, innovators, commercial side, non-commercial side. We're talking with anyone who is interested, and we're trying to figure out what form the data they need it in, how can we provide it to them effectively. But we're philanthropically funded, so we can't do every possible thing. So how do we get that to people who can spread that data out and really leverage it to the absolute maximum amount? And also we want the scientist community to test it and push it and shove it and make sure that we're doing the best job possible. We're not just putting it out and saying it's perfect, because we know that's not true. And again, Steve and Josh, who are sitting there, spend a lot of their time thinking about these very issues and how do we do that. And we're working with the science community. We have a science advisory group from leading scientists from around the world working with us. But the goal is to get that data in the hands of people who can use it to affect change. And everybody, and we have actually a graduate of the Harvard Business School on the team, whose job it is to lead all of that work. And she and I will be down in New York on Thursday with some of our other team from the corporate side of EDF, the EDF Plus Biz team, looking and talking with folks about it. The key is that because we're producing very different data than is currently available, part of it is we have to introduce that data, get people to understand the power of the data, what it can and can't do, and we're learning how to do that ourselves.
Yes, sir.
Jim Matheson from the Harvard Business School. Can you please address the impact of the geopolitical competition and tension in the Arctic over hopeful resources and or strategic prominence of the region, how you think that's going to impact your projections? Will it accelerate it or perturbate the work you're seeing as it relates to the climate impact of the region?
So say that again. So how
Great nation competition, people, the Arctic has become a region of great geopolitical interest. And I'm wondering, as that accelerates, how that might change your projections or potentially accelerate the impact of the region on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a shot at this. I have to say, I'm working on a synthesis paper with a bunch of scientists about disturbance impacts on carbon emissions, and one of the categories was this kind of direct human impact, although many of these are human impact. And it was the area where we had, one, the fewest experts, and two, the widest spread. So I have to say, it's not just me saying, I don't really know, but it actually is an area that is a bit of an unknown. But you can't imagine, as you're having more on the ground impacts, there's going to be more disturbances. More disturbances is more thaw is more emissions. I think the other thing that we're seeing is conflicts in land use will increase, and we're already seeing that now, where Indigenous lands, sometimes for things that we may think is a good thing in terms of green transition, like putting wind turbines in, but we're entering into a space where people are wanting to go in areas where they haven't been, and those are Indigenous lands, and so we need to be really careful about how we're doing that. So I think there's more human impact, ecosystem impact, and also climate impact. Quantifying it is tricky right now, honestly.
I think issues of collaboration are potentially going to become more difficult in some cases. But what we've seen so far, other than the situation with Russia and its connection to world geopolitics, we haven't seen a lot of that. We have great interest from the Chinese scientific community in improving Arctic science. China fashions itself as a near Arctic nation. It doesn't have any territorial water or land in the Arctic, but it has big interests in the Arctic. And so far, its contributions on the scientific side have been exemplary. We see continuing interest in the Russian scientists with whom we do have some contact. Continuing interest in finding ways to collaborate, continuing commitment to addressing the challenge. I mean, what I have found really for decades on these issues, not just in the Arctic but around the world, is the scientific communities are generally not remotely as political as the leaders of these countries, and they try to figure out ways to keep working together to address the problem and to call the possible solutions to the attention of policymakers. I think that's going to continue in spite of some complications from increased geopolitical competition.
But John, let me just add that if you have a significant increase in shipping, for example, over the top of Russia, will that have any kind of an impact?
Of course it will have an impact. It will have an impact on emissions of various kinds. The emissions of black smoke, which are a particular concern, will be much less than was previously thought because countries have agreed to change the fuels that they use in Arctic shipping to ameliorate that problem. There'll be big problems from shipping just in monitoring, search and rescue, dealing with spills, and so on. I mean, everybody who works on the Arctic understands that increased navigation around the Arctic is going to be a challenge for everybody, including because the United States is so deficient in icebreakers, which are still needed even as the ice shrinks. You're always working on the edges of the ice, and you need icebreakers. We have 1.5. I think the Russians have 41. Yeah, there are going to be big challenges around that, but not probably directly challenges in permafrost, which is bad enough, has enough challenges of its own without compounding by increased ship traffic.
Yes, over here. We have 4 questions over here.
Back.
And 5 minutes left.
6.
Sorry, I'll keep short, but I just wanted to follow up on that question from Jim. My name's David Babikian, doing some research in space and was curious on the opposite side, right? Like, what are the roles of international organizations, be it Arctic Council or now NATO, now that there are so many, Arctic states in NATO? Curious if that's come up in your work, or if it's, again, still like removed, to your point that the scientific community is not so, politically aligned, but curious.
Given we have a number of them, why don't we just go down and then take them all at once?
So Jamie Rosenfield with S&P Global and formerly with Henry Lee Center. So quick question for you, Stephen. Could you speak to the collaboration with industry, and particularly the OGCI and some of the organizations that EDF has really in some ways partnered with in the whole methane monitoring process?
Thanks for this panel. Bruce McKenney from the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to channel my colleague who didn't come here because she was too concerned that it would feel like we're doomed. And so I'm just curious. So there's another data point on your action and how people respond to information. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the feedback loops and just how fast they are accelerating, and if there are ways that we would see that decelerate and stop. Just curious what that's looking like, understanding the uncertainty.
Okay, I'm going to start with Steve and work backwards.
Okay, so on the question of working with the industry, as you've mentioned, we've worked quite extensively. We always, when we work with the industry, make sure, whether it's the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which you referenced, which is a group of 12 of the large oil and gas companies. We've worked with dozens of oil and gas companies and agricultural companies. We always work with independent researchers, so mainly academics, so that there are third parties collecting the data that we have input in and they have input, but do not have control over, so that there's a high level of trust. All the data gets published in the peer-reviewed literature, is transparent, so that it can hopefully lead to a better understanding. And I think the work that we did in the US to get that going, which we published then in Science in a paper in 2018, I think did just that. It's always a delicate balance of ensuring that we want to get the input. There's a lot of knowledge in industry, whatever you think about it, not just oil and gas, whether it's an ag, whatever, doing greenhouse gas emissions, you want that knowledge. And we worked here in Boston to map the local leaks. Nathan Phillips at BU had done some early work. We mapped it, made that totally public. We did that in 12 other cities. We worked with local utilities, but they did not have control. They did not get it. They could see the data, they could comment on it, but they could not control it. It was done by independent folks. So that's the kind of thing we'll do. We'll be working similarly, I'm sure, with Methane Sat. We're having lots of conversations, I believe with your company as well as others, about the data and how we can collaborate, but there is a clear line that the companies do not control the data. That will be done by agreed upon third party or independent, but used for validation.
So you want to talk about feedback loops?
Sure. And feedback loops go in both directions. So yes, and they are going in both directions right now. In the north and other areas, warming is causing some increase in plant growth, which can remove CO2 out of the atmosphere. That said, going to be overtopped by emissions from permafrost thaw. But yes, if we cool the climate, the permafrost can refreeze. The emissions that have been released, these are could be some ancient carbon. Like, it will take a while for that to be taken back up, but so we are committing ourselves and future generations. I think you talked about hope or optimism. I will say, I know a lot. If I had zero hope and zero optimism, I would not be here, right? I would just be like, I give up and I'm just going to have some fun and not work as much as I do from this. And so I do think having knowledge, yes, we have committed ourselves to some things, and people are being impacted and ecosystems are being impacted, but it could be bad. It could be really, really, really bad, right? And so we do have some control, and it's not as if we don't know what we can do. It's not like an asteroid is coming to hit us and we have no options. Like, we actually do know what we can do. And so to me, I think it seems like, okay, this is a solvable problem, and that at least helps to find a direction forward. And the work we're doing as scientists is, can we help guide that path a little bit better? Like, let's try not to get as lost and get there a little bit faster than we can.
John, you want to say about international?
Yeah, I very much would like to say international organizations are an important part of what we do. It's been one of the pillars of our focus in Arctic governance from the very beginning of our Arctic Initiative here at the Kennedy School. The director of our Arctic Initiative, Jen Spence, sitting in the second row, is an expert on the Arctic Council. She served as the executive director of the Sustainable Development Working Group in the Arctic Council, and has written with other members of our team important articles on how the Arctic Council can be strengthened in its operations. This is a really big deal. I mean, the Arctic Council has done a lot of good. The one thing it has not focused on, because it was not in its charter to focus on, was the security dimensions of the Arctic in the usual military sense of security. But that too is a focus that we are increasingly grappling with. It was not a major focus of our initiative from the outset, but we've come to understand that you can't do all the things we want to do in the Arctic without thinking about the geopolitical dimensions, the security dimensions as well. And in all of that, the international organizations play a huge role, and we're aware of it and engaging with them.
Well, this has been a terrific panel, so please join me in thanking the panel members.